All right. Hello and welcome back to the Untrodden podcast. I'm back here once again with Chris Cutrone, my first guest. He is, of course, the last Marxist, platypus, famous and infamous on the left online. And yeah, I brought him back because I really want to talk about philosophy, the philosophy of Marxism, the philosophical Marxism. You can say there's a political aspect, there's kind of a ethical, like social aspect. And then there's the philosophy. And for me, what I realized eventually in digging into this more is I felt like I was missing something. Like I felt like I really wouldn't be able to comprehend or really like be good faith towards Marxism without
Mm.
understanding philosophy itself and Hegel and really reading philosophy, which I hadn't done to this point. So yeah, I've spent some time reading Hegel. I also read Kant like a couple months ago, and a little bit of Hume and some other stuff. So I do want to talk about
hmm
those. And yeah, I mean, we can. I'm not sure where to start because I don't know much about. I don't know much about Greece. I know a little bit.
Right.
I have a hard time. I will actually. I'll make this remark, and you can tell me what you think about it,
Okay.
because there was a part of me that when I started undergrad and I read like Aristotle and a little bit of Plato. My thought was kind of like these guys are clearly very, they have very worthwhile ideas. They're very intelligent. There's like groundwork being laid here, but I kind of took it as like we've kind of stepped past this. Like they were at their own time, and we've kind of stepped past this, and it's valuable. And we haven't really gone past a lot of it, but it still is like kind of within its own time.
hmm
But then when you talk to someone like actually like Benjamin Studebaker, actually who I had on
Right.
here, he
Right.
thinks that there's kind of a peak of philosophy, I think there.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of a huge contradiction. That's a huge difference whether they are really, So I've had to rethink that, and I haven't, that hasn't been my main focus. So I haven't really engaged with the primary stuff there. But what do you think about that? What do you think about that problem there? What do you think about assess that period?
Yeah. So I would say that one could in fact argue that a certain peak of philosophy was reached in classical antiquity. With to use a Nietzschean phrase, the Socratic turn, or the turn to theoretical man or scientific man.
Right.
And there's obviously background for Plato and Aristotle, Plato's version of Socrates. There's the pre-Socratic philosophers. It's hard to think about this without also including the birth of science, because a lot of the pre-Socratic philosophers are also associated with the emergence of science. And so, one way of thinking about it in terms of like Hegel or Nietzsche is art, philosophy, science. What's that distinction about? And so, philosophy per se, and it's not unique to, ancient Greece. It's also something that you see, like Confucius. One sees the emergence of philosophy in classical civilization more generally. Also, the emergence of science in classical civilization around the world. Um, there's the idea of the axial age, right? So the emergence of science and philosophy from what was essentially a religious cosmology before that. And then, one could argue that there's been a kind of, I don't know, downhill slope from that peak of philosophy down through the Roman era and the Middle Ages, and then there's the question of modern society and modern philosophy. I always like to point out in the Muslim world, they preserved the memory of Aristotle, and
Right.
Aristotle was referred to simply as the philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, you know, now the question is, what do we mean by philosophy? And again, philosophy is distinct from theology. In the modern world, traditional philosophy, including Plato and Aristotle, although they still remain somewhat exceptional, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, um, in the Enlightenment, there was this question of philosophy. Is philosophy too close to theology? bound up with the idea of metaphysics.
Right.
And is metaphysics still too theological ultimately? And so there was an attempt in terms of modern philosophy to have a non-metaphysical, maybe even anti-metaphysical philosophy. And one certainly sees that in the 20th century. This is at the heart of the division between so-called analytic and continental philosophy. That analytic philosophy is non or anti-metaphysical, and continental philosophy is still willing to engage metaphysical questions. So now, when talking about the peak of philosophy, then it raises the question of progress in philosophy. What would progress in philosophy amount to? And how would one distinguish between progress in philosophy and progress in science? Right. So, maybe philosophy makes no progress, but science makes progress. But what would that mean about the relationship of science and philosophy?
Mm-hmm.
So again, metaphysics is the scientific revolution an anti-metaphysical revolution? Is it about freeing up scientific inquiry from metaphysical assumptions? That's usually the way we think about these things. Before we started, you mentioned Hume, or you might have also just mentioned Hume now. But so Humean empiricism, Humean skepticism with regard to theoretical claims is based on this idea that any kind
Right.
of philosophy or theoretical claim has an implicit metaphysics that we should beware of, right? So Kant, as you know, a modern philosopher, I mean, you could date modern philosophy in a number of ways. You could look at Descartes, Spinoza, John Locke, David Hume, Kant as a certain kind of birth of modern philosophy, uh, is revolutionary and it's critical philosophy because it's trying to put metaphysics on a different basis. So the idea is that we can't really think without metaphysical categories.
Right.
So the question is, what is the status of those metaphysical categories? How do we understand the substance of those categories? Do they have a substance, or are they just sort of disposable fictions that we have? They're kind of theoretical generalizations from empirical observation, but they have no substance in and of themselves. So Kant and Hegel and Marx think that actually there is a substance to the metaphysical categories. There's a social substance, as a societal substance, meaning metaphysics refers to categories of our social relations. They refer to our practical relations with each other, with nature, and with ourselves as members of society. Right. So then that brings in the question of philosophy and social theory, and the status of social theory, the social sciences, what social science would be, as opposed to physical sciences. What would social science be? And so, of course, when you mention Plato and Aristotle as thinkers of politics, is it a social theory? Is it a kind of a science of society? Is it a social philosophy? What is it? What's the status of these kinds of claims? Like if you read Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Politics, right? What kind of claims are being made? What kind of an object are they addressing? Right? Because they're not addressing the physical universe, they're addressing society,
Right.
right? And so the Kantian revolution, which is really motivated by Rousseau, Kant was inspired by Rousseau to make his critical turn. And Rousseau is a philosopher, he's an Enlightenment philosopher. He's a philosopher. What kind of a philosopher is he? A social philosopher, a moral philosopher? What's going on? I mean, he's, like a polymath kind of guy, like a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. Um, Rousseau is pretty much accorded the respect of being the birth of social theory, critical social theory, especially, right? Even though others had written on society. So
Right.
we have like Hobbes and Locke. So usually we think of like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau
Mm-hmm.
as That's your kind of triumvirate
Yeah.
of modern thinkers about society.
Mm-hmm.
Are they political philosophers? What are they? They're social contract theorists. What does that mean? Right. And yet they're actually quite different. Locke and Rousseau are on one side and Hobbes is on the other side, um, in terms of their political orientation. Right. So Hobbes was a conservative. He was a reactionary, in fact, with respect to the English Civil War, the English Revolution. Whereas Locke is the thinker of the Glorious Revolution in England, more than a generation later, and Rousseau is a mid 18th century inspirer of the American and French revolutions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, again, the line of, from Rousseau to Marx is pretty clear, but it's via Kant and Hegel. In other words, there is a kind of detour via philosophy.
Right.
And in fact, Kant thought that it was Rousseau who clued him in to the origin of metaphysical categories in our social relations.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, again, to use a kind of Emile Durkheim, a sociologist, to use his expression, social forms are forms of thought, or social forms are forms of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
or forms of consciousness are social forms. Like, think of it that way. So now, again, what do we mean by philosophy? And usually, philosophy does mean, like, philosophy per se usually means metaphysics, meaning it is understood that, like, analytic philosophy is not really philosophy in the conventional, traditional sense of philosophy. And so that usually the analytic philosophers, they have some respect for Kant,
Mm-hmm.
but they see Hegel as the great opponent, right? So they kind of create this division between Kant and Hegel that I don't think is particularly warranted. But I think that you mentioned in your email correspondence with me, Jacobi,
Mm-hmm.
right? So Jacobi's famous phrase is that Kant was wrong, but Hegel is not even wrong,
Right.
right? So again, wrong about what,
Yeah.
right? And what would it mean to not even be wrong, right? So not even wrong, you know, would seem to cast it into, if it's irrationalism or theology, like I don't know what basket that throws Hegel into exactly. Um, but you know, and again, Karl Popper, famously, the Open Society and its enemies,
Right.
right? A kind of ordo liberal, kind of Vienna school ordo liberal or Austrian school ordo liberal. The big enemies of the Open Society are Plato, Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Kant's accepted.
Right.
They make an exception for Kant, but you'd be hard pressed to say that Kant's social views or political views are really different from Rousseau or Hegel or Marx.
Right.
Right? And in what way they're different from Plato, that would open up a question with respect to what Ben Studebaker said in your conversations. So I think that he said that the three thinkers that we have to engage are Plato, Hobbes, and Marx,
Right.
right? And I feel like that leaves a great deal out. What about Rousseau?
Mm-hmm.
And, what about Kant and Hegel? And, it's a question of liberalism, really, because Rousseau's got this ambiguous, you know, legacy.
Mm-hmm.
He could either be seen as a certain kind of birth of liberalism or a kind of totalitarianism, a kind of illiberalism. And is Kant a liberal? He seems to be more of a liberal. Is Hegel a liberal? I studied with Robert Pippin. For better or worse, he's sort of labeled as a liberal Hegelian. Like he kind of
Right.
makes Hegel into a liberal.
Mm-hmm.
In the 20th century, in the early 20th century, Hegel was seen as responsible for totalitarianism, for German militarism, for Nazism,
Mm-hmm.
as well as for Marxism and
Yeah. Of
Stalinism.
course. Yeah.
You know, and a lot of 20th century thought is about rejecting Hegel on that basis,
Mm-hmm.
and it runs the gamut. Postmodernism
Right.
is about rejecting Hegel as a totalitarian thinker. But what if he was a liberal? What would that mean? right? So these are the questions that are opened up, I think, by this question of philosophy, and especially in a political and social context.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there that I want to talk about more specifically. So, I think one place I want to start is so I started reading Kant. I read the entirety of the Critique of Pure Reason. I haven't read enough of his other works, which I think are also important, but I have read about them. I've read like secondary works about them, but I haven't gotten to the Practical Reason. And
Prolegomena is good,
yeah, I've read that one too, but I read the Critique first, and then I read that one just to kind of like
right?
double it over, I guess. But
Yeah, yeah.
um, so the thing that I have is that I would say that Hume is very interesting to me because Hume is kind of my like pre-reading all of this. That's my philosophical position, roughly. I don't agree with everything, but roughly his like metaphysical skepticism, his skepticism of like moral philosophy, where he basically says
Yeah.
this is about custom and feeling. Like that's pretty much what I believe. Like I've had this. I remember like years ago, I was like, I my basic philosophical position was, if I imagine the beginning of society, why is murder wrong? Because you don't want to be murdered, and it's practically powerful to not want to be murdered, and so it becomes wrong. That was my idea, and I think that's roughly the kind of framework that he's working with there in the book on morality, where he says, we kind of just acquire these habits, these customs, and they work for us. And so I find Hume very compelling, but there's also something boring about that. It's also like, okay, great, I agree with all this roughly, and that's great. But I also want to, I also want to get past that and see past that and see what the questions to that are, what the problems with that are. And so Kant argues, right? I've had this frustration with philosophy people,
Mm,
because people will defend. So Kant will say that he's a transcendental idealist, right? And so really, what he's doing there is, as you mentioned, there's like the metaphysical realm, and so what he's really doing there is he's trying to say we can use science and we can justify science and use it to truly unpack and deal with the metaphysical realm. We're not just going to like, throw it away like Hume might do. We're going to deal with it. We're really going to put it in its proper place critically. And so that's a really like I understand that, I read the critique and I understood what he was trying to do very well, and I think that is very unique and special, and it's powerful. But the question I always ask is like, what if you just don't believe him, kind of? And the biggest issue that I have with that is that when people say he's not an idealist, and this is where I get annoyed, is because people will constantly say you don't understand Kant, right? So Ayn Rand has this famous thing where she would say that Kant put everything in the mind, and he degraded consciousness because he said that everything is subjective, and that's degrading the objective powers of consciousness, right? And so people will say she doesn't understand Kant at all, and that may or may not be true. I'm absolutely not a defender of her, but I feel like they're kind of not dealing with the question. They're not taking up the question, and that's really about the things in themselves and our experience. And there is kind of this question in Kant of like, if everything is just subjectively constructed, um, like at the end of the day, it feels like a matter of faith to believe that all of this is subjectively constructed and that this is just how subjective experience exists. you know Subjective experience per se. It feels like you kind of have to agree with him and believe him, and I feel like there's not enough time spent on whether or not he was right. Although realistically, this debate is addressed in all the continuing decades of philosophy, right? I mean, this really is rejected. But I feel like this question is kind of sidestepped or ignored as if you must objectively see the great revolution that Kant made. And while I understand it on paper why it would be a great revolution, I keep asking this question of like, what if you don't believe him? What if you aren't convinced? I guess.
I mean, look, so Kant, poor Kant. So first of all, there's a problem with centering the first critique, meaning making everything into an epistemological question.
Right.
Because of course, epistemology is not everything. And so really the issue is subjective idealism, right? So let's leave the question of transcendental idealism aside and pose it as subjective idealism. So that means that ideas and ideas as metaphysical in character, in other words, a priori ideas, ideas that are not grounded in empirical sense data perception, but that are prior to any empirical sense data perception. What's the status of that? Right. So the big debate in Kant's time is empiricism and rationalism. And what he wants to say is that they're both right and they're both wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And rationalism does seem to smack of theology. It seems to smack of a kind of divine spark idea of consciousness. And, I mean, in some ways you could say Kant's Cartesian, he's a follower of Descartes, meaning we can't really question that we're questioning, right? We can't really doubt that we're doubting, right? That just doesn't make any sense. And so if we're going to think at all, we have to at least grant ourselves no doubt or skepticism about the fact that we are skeptical and doubting and thinking about that, right? So, but again, the subject, the faculties of the subject, right? And the faculties of the subject are practical as well as theoretical. So the first critique is just about theory, it's about concepts, it's about the understanding. And of course, Kant does not think that that is actually primary. What's primary is practice, practical reason, or reason, meaning reason comes before understanding, meaning we act in the world, we engage with the world
Mm-hmm.
before we have a theory of it, before we have an understanding of it, before we have a concept of it. So the way that I like to teach this is the true, the good, and the beautiful. He starts with the true in the first critique. He moves on to the good in the second critique, practical reason. And then the third critique is supposed to be the completion of the system, and that's the beautiful or aesthetic judgment,
Right.
which he actually thought is underpinning both the understanding and practical reason. So when I teach Kant, I teach the third critique.
Right.
And there is also, in terms of the relation between Kant and Hegel,
Mm-hmm.
people who go from first critique to Hegel really miss something because Hegel's really based on the third critique.
Right. Yeah.
And it's the synthesis of theory and practice,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so subjective idealism, meaning these categories are about our subjective faculties. They're not about properties of things in themselves or of the world, meaning nothing in the world or a thing is not true or good or beautiful in itself, right? There's no truth in the sense of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's only truth in terms of our concept of the object, meaning we're not talking about a thing, we're talking about an object. And to have an object, you have to have a subject. If there was no subject, there would be no objects. There wouldn't even be things. There would just be, as Kant puts it, the sensuous manifold. There would just be a flux of matter and energy.
Mm-hmm.
There would be no time, no space,
Right.
right? Without a subject, there aren't any of these things. There's just a universe, and it is what it is, right? So it's only from the standpoint of a subject, primarily a practical subject, and then a theoretical subject, that there are objects, that there are concepts grasping objects.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really important because, of course, human beings, Homo sapiens, we're a natural species, we're organic creatures, but we're members of society. And it's in society that we transform our faculties, that we don't just act on instinct or physical need, that we don't just do pattern recognition cognition, right? That we are given by society, by culture, right? By our practical relations with each other,
Mm-hmm.
ways of dealing with the world that we wouldn't have as biological organisms. That is what philosophy is about, right? We don't know the world without society. We don't know the world as biological organisms. We only know the world as members of society. We only practically interact with the world as members of society. That's it. And that's what metaphysics refers to. The metaphysics that we inhabit are the metaphysics of society. They're not the metaphysics of the physical universe. Because the physical universe is just what it is. Neither time nor space, none of it exists. So there's a famous debate between um, Henri Bergson and Einstein
Mm-hmm.
about time, or in the early 20th century. And Einstein said to Bergson, who was the most popular philosopher in the world at that time, and now we've completely forgotten about him. Einstein said, this thing that you philosophers talk about time, we physicists know it doesn't really exist,
Mm-hmm.
right? So again, the first critique, Kant, he says we can't cognize anything without notions of time and space. But where do we get those from? Because if you look at culture, if you look at society throughout history, what you find is that people have substantially transformed their notions of time and space. Different cultures, different societies have fundamentally different notions of time and space, and they're derived from social practices.
Mm-hmm.
People have inhabited different metaphysical universes across history. And that's what Kant's really concerned with. He's concerned with the conditions of possibility. That's what critique means for these subjective faculties. But really, what he's concerned with is how we change those faculties. So we have these faculties. We have every culture has the notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful. But what the true, the good, and the beautiful mean has radically changed over history. And that's been a function of society,
Right.
right? So our practical relations with the world have changed, and therefore our way of thinking has changed. Our philosophy has changed. And it's the awareness of that, the awareness that these categories have substance, but that substance changes. They do have substance. The true or truth has a substance. The good has a substance. The beautiful has a substance, but that substance changes. It's very different from ancient philosophy, where it's assumed that the substance is eternal and only our concept of things is variable. And that's basically a function of error,
Right.
meaning the way the world appears is deceptive and the essence is true. And we can never really know the essence.
Mm-hmm.
We're way past that with Kant. We're way past that with the Enlightenment. We're already past that with Descartes and Spinoza. We're way past that. So we have to be aware of the fact that the kinds of philosophical questions we ask ourselves now might actually be pre-philosophical. They may not even reach where Kant's starting.
Right. I mean, I just think that I would argue that you can get a lot of the social critique out of Hume. Like, I think you can get a lot of social critique, awareness of these categories. So I feel like the problem for me is that Kant wants
But then
to.
they're merely conventional,
That's true. Yeah.
right? So society is not merely a convention. It's a history.
Right.
It's practical history.
But then once you say that, I think this is like the debate, I guess. So once you say it's a practical history, you're kind of making an argument that there is a necessary, end of history,
Yes.
which obviously Kant believes
Well, not
that.
an end to history. There's a necessity to history, let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah. I mean
Right. That
that's
doesn't mean an end to history. It means a necessity to history, meaning we are where we are now, not by accident.
right. I think that's possibly the biggest issue I have, I guess.
You think we
Um,
might be here by accident?
yeah, I do think so in some sense. So I think the gap, and this also comes up in Hegel. I did want to talk about Hegel's philosophy of history a lot
Right.
too, but Kant does write when he writes about history. He says if we look at history as just sort of like an endless repetition of tragedy, like
Yeah.
this is going nowhere. Like you have to practically, even though I can't prove it, like I can't justify how it, like I can't justify each step. There has to be a direction it's going in. There has to be a necessary development towards freedom, I guess, in Kant's case and in Hegel's case. And
Yep.
so that I find that like argument very like compelling, right? I find that argument very compelling, but I also don't see how it's like justified, I guess, metaphysically. So it really does feel to me like there's kind of like, I'm saying that the social critique is in Hume, right? We both agreed with that, and it is very conventional, and I agree with that, right? But there's kind of a leap you make where you say, based on how it is now, we can construct the idea that there's a necessity, and I don't know how you
Here's
like
the hard
ground that
part.
or
Here's
justify
the
that,
hard part. Freedom. What do we mean by freedom?
right?
Right. Meaning is the way things are, are things the way they are. as a function of our freedom. And what would that mean? Right. So it's really, again, it's a pre-philosophical question from a Kantian point of view, namely free will
Mm-hmm.
versus determinism. We're supposed to be past that,
Mm-hmm.
meaning it's not a question of, freedom as like a metaphysical claim. It's rather the reverse, which is that metaphysics is a projection of our freedom. It's not that, oh, you have to make a metaphysical claim in order to claim our freedom. It's rather the opposite. We only have metaphysics because we're free. Again, it's Rousseau.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the development or direction of history is concerned, freedom is neither good nor bad.
Of course.
It's beyond good and evil,
Of course, yeah.
right? In other words, we are where we are in a bad situation because of our freedom,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's not to say we're here by necessity and isn't it great?
Yeah, of course not, yeah.
You know, it's not that at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, again, progress and freedom is a tricky thing because actually, what we're talking about, we're not talking about like progress in the good, especially in some traditional sense,
Right.
because after all, what is good? What is the good? So this is the difference between me and Benjamin Studebaker
Mm-hmm.
is that the one, the Platonic one, and the good is a projection of the one. Um, I don't really think so because, God knows what's good, really. And actually, good is not an ethical category in Kant exactly, not in a traditional sense.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning it's a practical thing, meaning why do we desire the things that we desire and how do we get them in practice?
Mm-hmm.
In a morally neutral sense, right? Because what we're really concerned with is how our morality changes. Does our morality improve? Who knows? But it definitely changes. And it definitely complexifies. The one thing that we can say about our freedom is that it becomes a more complex proposition, meaning we live in a practical sense, we live in a much more morally complex world in the modern world than people did in the past.
Right.
Again, whether that's good or bad,
Mm-hmm.
it simply is the case that we actually, in a practical sense, in an intuitive, commonsensical way, and in the realm of feeling, we inhabit and are able to navigate subjectively a much more morally complex universe than people did in the past. That's progress, right?
Right.
We've complexified.
I don't necessarily. I guess there's something about. I don't have a problem with identifying it that way. I don't have a problem with like looking at history that way. The problem I have is there's something about moving into the realm of like objective necessity where
Hmm.
you're basically claiming that you can know that there is an order, and I agree with you. I don't mean progress in like a positive sense. I just mean like a direction. I just mean that there's something there. It's not just aimless or arbitrary. I have a hard time moving from the area of arbitrary or random because for me it seems like there's so much arbitrary in terms of how we conceive of metaphysical ideas, how we conceive of ourselves, how we operate in the world. There's just so much randomness to me that it seems to me that history is sort of a non-random like manifestation of randomness. Like you can't get rid of the random parts, and it feels like sometimes kind of like the Hegelian view of history turns into like a just so story where he
Mm.
kind of says like Chinese history is this because they view the view of themselves this way. The emperor is really like the only free human. He's the only like movement that matters. And so what ends up happening is they just cycle. They just cycle. They're kind of like stuck in the immediacy of their ethical law as is manifest in the emperor, and they just repeat that cycle endlessly. And that's interesting. Like that's not necessarily wrong, but I'm also not convinced that it's right. It just feels like kind of like a story, like a way of viewing things that seems to me like
Well,
quite
from
useful.
our standpoint, it looks that way,
Right.
right? Meaning that certainly European history was kind of that way too,
Of course, yeah.
right? But maybe in a less coherent way, in a more jumbled way. Um, I mean, it's the necessity. So here's the other piece of the puzzle, because I was going to say, okay, so you kind of have free will, determinism, and contingency or accident or randomness,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe those three things. Um, so even how necessity is understood, what kind of necessity? So not physical necessity, because it does seem that we are able to transcend what was previously understood as physical necessity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like clearly we're able to
Right.
change the nature of matter and energy, right? So whatever
Mm-hmm.
people thought was physically necessary in the past, we've burst those bounds.
Mm-hmm.
We've already burst the bounds of Newtonian space and time
Yeah.
in practice, right? Our everyday life could
Mm-hmm.
not be as it is if we haven't already burst the bounds of Newtonian space and time, Newtonian physics. So necessity, not in the physical sense, but the necessity that we give ourselves, right? Social necessity.
Mm-hmm.
So with what necessity has society developed? It's developed by the necessity of freedom, meaning the necessity that we've obeyed in our historical development has been the necessity of freedom, namely that we must necessarily overcome our current state of affairs. And that's not like just like right this very second or every generation or something like that. That's in the long span of historical time,
Mm-hmm.
right? So ultimately, things must change. And they must change on the basis of an internal necessity rather than an external necessity. Because even if it's in the face of an external necessity, it's going to be on the basis of the internal resources of the community that that external necessity is faced and overcome.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the self-moving substance that is subject, Geist,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's society.
Right.
That's not the physical universe,
Of course. Yeah.
right? That's society. And so the self-moving substance that is subject, it's movement. That's what we're really thinking about. With what necessity does it move?
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't move like at the same pace all the time. I mean, Hegel says there are, blank pages, there are dead times, there are times without history, there are times and places without history,
Right. For sure.
right? Which people freak out about because they think that that only means non-Western times and places. He doesn't mean that,
Sure.
right? There's also times and places in Western history where there is no history, meaning we might be living in such a time now.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning the fact is that we might not believe Hegel because we might be living in one of those blank pages
Mm-hmm.
in this stage of capitalism.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I just have. See, I don't. I find. I guess this is kind of like a pragmatist taking up of Hegel. I think I'm very sympathetic to that because I find a lot of value in the idea of spirit and kind of a self consciousness and self critical, self engaging. I find a lot of value in those ideas. Like I find those very compelling. So I don't want to just throw out.
Self-consciousness.
Right. That's why I don't really agree with the ideas of Hegel as just being like a rationalist like freak who's just like
Right.
I can't really. There does seem to be this like antinomy, I guess you could say, regarding Hegel, where it really feels like it's either he's like the most important, he's like he's at the top, or he's just an insane person, and I kind of like reject that. Like I think that there, at least as I stand now, I'm not convinced of him in its entirety, but I think there has to be something there. But the problem I have, and I guess you could argue that Hegel himself acknowledges that, you can't peer into the future and figure out where it's
Can't.
going to go, right? I mean,
Right.
philosophy is its own time, grasps in thought, and the Owl of Minerva, and that, yeah, obviously the philosophy of right, but
The teleology is the teleology of the present, not of the future. That's
right.
very important.
Yeah, but that's where I start to like. I want to say that's fair, but then I still wonder if that's possible. So I wanted to use another example that you gave when you were talking about Hegel's philosophy of history, and you were talking about Protestantism and Catholicism, and you were talking about how there's this an interesting dynamic where the Protestants really were like radical, like the Catholics are very sympathetic, Like I've always been very sympathetic to Catholics because they are like they're they think about things. They're like, this is how it should be done. We're not just gonna like be burning people alive randomly. Like that's absurd. Okay, we just they really are understandable. I'm very sympathetic to Catholics, right? Especially in the in the sense that they educate
Aquinas.
people. And yeah,
Hmm.
sure. I mean, I prefer Augustine a little bit, but I also haven't
Sure.
really read
Yeah, yeah.
Aquinas, so that's fair.
Mhm.
But then the Protestants, they're simultaneously they're the freaks, the fundamentalists, but also they paved the way for the secularization, the Enlightenment, all of that, all of this
Yep.
Western ideal, which we would
Yep.
say is transcending both the Protestant and the Catholic
That's right.
dichotomy. It's transcending both of them through the. So
Right.
that's the kind of historical development and necessity you're talking about,
Paradoxical. Yeah.
right? But the problem I have is like it feels a bit like we're making a metaphysical claim where we're saying that the paradox is necessary. There will be a paradox. This is a necessary thing. Whereas I hesitate with that because in my mind I'm always thinking there must be like a different way to look at this, right? There's always a different
Well, that's
perspective and
true.
a different
I mean,
viewpoint.
I've got a little caveat to all this, which
Hmm.
is Marxism.
Right.
Meaning, maybe Hegel's whole notion of like dialectic is itself historically delimited. In
Mm.
other words, only refers to the metaphysics of bourgeois society, bourgeois emancipation,
Hmm.
a certain kind of transformation of our social relations, and that beyond bourgeois society, beyond capitalism, maybe this would no longer be the case. So it's Adorno, that beyond capitalism would be
Right.
beyond totality and beyond contradiction, and therefore beyond dialectic.
Hmm.
So that's the other point. I mean, Hegel's claim is that it's he's trying to understand the necessity, we might say, um, according to which, looking back on the past from the standpoint of the turn of the 19th century, circa 1800, with what necessity does the past appear self-contradictory to us? Why does it appear self-contradictory to us? And why does it appear that the present is some kind of resolution of that contradiction in the past? That's a powerful idea, you know,
Yeah.
that you could grasp all of history as a totality, but as a self-contradictory totality that we have resolved in some way now, but that will unravel,
Hmm.
right? That the present will always regard the past as self-contradictory and as not merely self-contradictory, but as motivating through that contradiction, producing the present. Right? The caveat is Marx is like, that might be the story of bourgeois society, but that may not be the story after bourgeois society. History may not move that way
Hmm.
beyond bourgeois society. So, the way Engels put it is, capitalism is the last stage of the animal kingdom. It's the last stage of
Hmm.
prehistory, and after capitalism will be true human history. And that therefore we will regard historical development very differently than Hegel had to, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that's an important point too, because um, that's not a wholly new idea. It's an aspect of Hegel that's drawn out by Marxism, meaning Hegel acknowledges that as well. That there is a kind of changing character of the dialectic, the changing character of contradiction, that when we're going from classical antiquity into the Christian Germanic world, and then when we're moving into the modern world, that this movement is not actually all the same,
Hmm.
right? These transitions are not all quite the same. And yet, from the standpoint of 1800, they all become one thing, right? They all become uh, spirit moving through its self contradictions and arriving at the present. But the present not as an achieved state, but as a task, meaning the present as, we have a consciousness of our task.
Hmm.
Marx brings out the other side of it, which is that we do recognize the task as it presents itself to us now. In retrospect, that recognition will appear as a misrecognition because the result of overcoming from what people think it's going to be,
Right.
right? So that's an important thing too. Now, for me as a Marxist, what it means is that beyond capitalism is not going to be what we think when we think of like socialism and communism, right?
Right.
That socialism and communism are a projection out of capitalism. They're
Mm-hmm.
ideologies of capitalism,
Mm-hmm.
and the future beyond capitalism won't be exactly as we imagine it to be. It won't be what we desire.
That makes sense.
It
Yeah.
will be something different.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll look back and say, that struggle for socialism was itself a misrecognition and was self-contradictory,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's a way of, you know, um, again, misrecognition and recognition. I think that's an important point. That again is there. It's there in Kant and Hegel, but it's sort of a minor note, and then it's sort of emphasized by Marxism. And you don't really have like, the thing is, do other philosophers provide these kinds of resources for thinking about,
Right.
relationship between society, consciousness, you know, movement of history? Like it's not supposed to be like neatly tied up in a bow or something. It's supposed to provoke deep and disturbing questions about what we think we're doing when we act in the social and political
It
world.
it does feel like a new way of answering questions and like kind of like a method that remains to be, articulated and exercised, I guess, mostly are exercised. And that's what I'm very sympathetic to. That's why I am struggling with it because I am trying to and there is something intuitive about it to me even because I was thinking about kind of the transition from like the Roman Empire to Christianity,
Yeah.
and I was thinking about there's kind of this like story told about the difference between like paganism and Christianity, and you can tell all kinds of
Uh,
different stories. You can say
right.
paganism was garbage, obviously, or you could say paganism was enlightened and the Christians like Dark Ages, they just like got rid of all knowledge. And when I was
True.
thinking about it recently, I was kind of thinking it there really is like both are true. Like
Yes.
they took the intelligence and the enlightened, but they also transcended to a level of metaphysics that was not in paganism, and they also regressed in the way that they asked questions. Like both were true. Like and that really is another example of the kind of example you gave, and so there is something intuitive about that to even me. Like obviously I have the part of me that just wants to be human, say I don't know anything, but there is
Right.
also that intuition as well.
Socrates. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there really is like, but I'm still so it really like what you're saying like it really makes sense to me. I just I feel like I'm missing the knowing that really does feel like the missing piece because it is possible that we get past capitalism and we have something that we can't imagine. And I totally understand like the idea that socialism as it stands now is really like a vulgar within capitalists, like it really has nothing to do with if our society really did transform to a new level of organization and consciousness and all of that, it really would be something that we can't even imagine.
Totally different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm very sympathetic to that, but the problem I have is how do I know that that's going to happen? I mean, why couldn't it be the case that we
It
are
might not
just
happen.
animals and we're self-reflecting and we reach this point and this is about as good as it's going to get, and then we might regress even. We might just regress a little bit. And I just don't know how you I don't know how you get like the faith, and what I want is to read Hegel enough and say, okay, here's the proof. Here's the math equation that proves that this
Yeah,
contradiction
no,
is in
that's
there.
not going to happen.
Well, yeah,
That's
of
not going to
course.
happen.
Yeah.
It's not a matter of proof or faith. And so the way that I like to put it is, we have to proceed without any safety net. There's no safety net. That's freedom,
Right.
right? We don't have a safety net. And at the same time, like, uh, I would say that doubt about this um, is, manifest, meaning it's, like the world around us. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we live in a pessimistic time.
Oh yeah.
And, but I mean, I'm not going to say, like, look, there are all sorts of Marxists out there, quote unquote Marxists.
Yeah.
They're kind of not. And so, they'll just say, that, well, capitalism must end.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, I guess so, but on what time scale,
Right. And the basis that they're using
right?
to make that conclusion isn't really like what you would want them to be using to make that conclusion, right? Like,
That's right.
yeah, it's
You know,
It's
I
a
think
yeah.
we have to overcome it ourselves. Like it's not just going to happen. I mean, again, it goes to subjectivity,
Hmm.
meaning are we subjects or are we objects of the historical process? Now again, Marxism would have an explanation, if you will, for why we seem stuck
Hmm.
between being subjects and objects of history. Because if we're objects of history, then it happens to us and then it's accidental, arbitrary, random, right? Then there is no necessity
Hmm.
to any of it. Well, what if that's just our moment now? Like, what if that's,
Right.
not a claim that one could make about humans everywhere at all times? So, now in terms of regression and progression, again, progress in consciousness of freedom, Hegel, in terms of our consciousness of freedom now, what led to it, right? That would be the progress in consciousness of freedom. Now, we might have sacrificed a lot along the way
Mm.
and lost a lot along the way. But again, one has to pinch oneself and say, maybe that's just the feeling we have in capitalism, because capitalism wastes a lot. You know, I think that the way Kant puts it in the idea for universal history from a cosmopolitan point of view, he says nature is parsimonious in her gifts. She
Hmm.
gives us just enough to be able to progress as we need to.
Right.
And of course, by nature, not physical biological nature, but historical nature, meaning everything that has developed and that we have participated in developing, right? That historical progress has been parsimonious. It's only given us what we've needed. Now, again, the thought that we have in capitalism is quite different, which is that maybe we've wasted a lot of resources, a lot of potential. Maybe we're constantly wasting. And I think that that contributes to the sense that we have of the aimlessness and the non-necessary character,
Hmm.
right? And that I think we shrink from the task when we're caught in like deer in the headlights of just the tremendous apocalyptic level of wastefulness, destruction, unnecessary suffering that we've inflicted on ourselves, that are not, you because some of it is random accident. Of course there are random accidents,
There's not like
but
one villain. You can't just say the rich people, the billionaires, they did this to us. They inflicted capitalism upon
right,
us. That's really not
right.
the question.
I mean, obviously that's a plausible story from a certain point of view, and yet that is not the task. You know, I always like to say that if I, gave a very compelling TED talk at Davos and convinced all the rich and powerful people that they should
Right.
be communists, that they would not be able to bring it about. And they would have the people to blame, right? They would
Hmm.
be like, "Oh, we tried our best, but the people didn't want it. The people wanted this animalistic capitalism after all."
And they'd be right. They would be right. Right.
They'd
That's
be
what.
right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
They'd be right, right? And so this is just a very tricky proposition,
Hmm.
you know? And with what kind of social and political necessity? Like, how do we act in such a way as to produce necessity, to produce the necessity of moving on to the next stage?
Hmm.
Because right now it's unclear, or it's clear in this very bizarre way, like Elon Musk, like we should be a multi-planet species because otherwise we'll destroy ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's like, we can destroy ourselves as a multi-planet species too,
Of course.
right? So, um, and also that's just, on what time scale? Like, terraforming Mars is going to take thousands of years.
Hmm.
Colonizing Mars will probably take hundreds of years, and that's just not, that's not any kind of conceivable historical time frame. So it's and also it becomes technical, it becomes very impoverished at the level of social and political imagination,
Hmm.
you know. we should have a changed relation to each other and to this planet. You know, that's going to be easier to achieve than
Mm-hmm.
transplanting our problems to another planet. So, um, you know, I think that Hegel should be demystified. So I won't, there has been this kind of like Hegel fashion, Hegel craze, Hegel
Mm.
enthusiasm in the last generation with the
Mm-hmm.
millennials.
Right.
I've known these students, and I kind of feel like, let's take it down a notch. Meaning like, okay, Hegel's like thrilling, but maybe it's just like, you're smoking Hegel like a drug, and maybe it's not really meant to be read that way. And don't get drunk on Hegel. Try to deal with it more rationally, more soberly. In other words, Hegel should sober us up, not intoxicate us.
Mm-hmm.
And if he's intoxicating us, maybe it's about us. It's not about Hegel, right? Maybe that's the kind of intoxication one gets from not understanding, from turning it into some kind of like, I don't know, poetry or something, turning it into an aesthetical object. So I'm very wary of that. That's why, um, yeah, I mean, Kant is trippy too, though. Kant is trippy too.
Yeah.
So, but people go to Hegel the way they go from Heidegger to Hegel. And even Heidegger should be approached soberly, even though he kind of defies that.
Mm-hmm.
So again, like I just think, I really believe all bets are off, meaning it's not a matter of like proof or faith or belief for me. For me, I find Marx and Kant and Hegel like really interesting because by comparison, I find other things kind of wanting and kind of just ultimately less interesting, even though they can kind of be fun to play with a little bit. And, you read, you learn, you kind of stretch your mind. But that in the end, I come back to, yeah, but, does it really, does Heidegger get us past, do the analytic philosophers really get us past this horizon
Mm-hmm.
that we've been in, with Kant? And whether Hegel is progress over Kant, again, Adorno said Hegel is a fulfillment of Kant, meaning it doesn't really transcend the horizon of Kant. And so yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be a just so story. It shouldn't be like I like this philosophy because I find believing it consoling. And I think that's another thing that people want to go to philosophy for. They want philosophy to ground them.
Mm-hmm.
They want philosophy to give them certainty. And it's like that's not what philosophy is for. That's what it used to be for. Like that's ancient philosophy. That's traditional philosophy. But although for the actual philosophers, it wasn't even true of that, right? But I just think it's a kind of an abuse. Like people should do religion instead. And then again, even theology is a mystery. That's the whole point. Like like it kind of it protects you against the terror, the existential terror, but not entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It gives you a handle on it, you know. But even religion can be abused if it just like solves the problem or something.
Right.
You know,
I did want to
so I
note.
think that's the point.
I did want to note when you say capitalism, I have kind of an aversion to that word being used in any context because usually the left using that word, it's just sort of like a demonic thing that they can just unthinkingly,
Right,
like they're
right,
intentionally shutting off their thinking. They're like, okay, I can't think anymore, so it's capitalism. I guess that's probably what it is.
right,
And but I
right.
feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say capitalism, what you're really talking about is our current stage of consciousness and social relation. Like
Yes,
that's really what you're talking about there.
yes,
Right.
yeah. I would say, I've tried to sort of pay attention to things in the Trumpian era. So
Mm-hmm.
I watched the All In podcast, the venture capitalist
Oh
guys,
yeah.
the kind of tech
Yeah.
bros, and they're interesting or whatever. It's whatever, right? And there are relatively few degrees of separation between people I know and them, in
Mm-hmm.
fact. because it's a small world in the end,
Really,
and
yeah.
especially in the higher education world.
Hmm.
So, however, right? So, um, yeah, they were talking about AI and automation, and will this get rid of jobs? Will this be a fundamental, like, destruction of capitalism? And what they resolved on was, no, we'll just have to find new ways of valuing our time and exchanging the value of our time. And I was like, these all in podcast guys understand capitalism a lot better than like most Marxists,
Hmm.
right? Because at least that's the first determination is, yeah, we'll be living in capitalism from their perspective insofar as we are still at a practical level figuring out how we're going to exchange the value of our time in society. Now, of course, what they mean by that is that's bourgeois society.
Hmm.
Capitalism is the crisis of that,
Hmm.
right? And I think that people think socialism is just a fairer way of doing that. And it's like, yeah, actually the problem is that we're trying to do that, but it's not working. Meaning whatever crisis AI brings about, it's not going to be the one that we think it's going to be.
Hmm.
It's not just going to be replacing all work with jobs and having to do a UBI, right? It's going to be a more twisted, perverse, unexpected problem. And it's because at a rational level, at a practical level, we will be trying to find the value of our time and social exchange, but capitalism is the thing that prevents us from doing that. And that poses the question of do do we need to be doing that? Right? Again, they kind of naturalize it in a way that maybe we could have a different basis of society than this kind of utilitarian economy of time.
Right. I wanted to ask you also about this is actually from a while ago. I made a note about this, but found this article from Curtis Yarvin. Um,
Uh-huh.
and obviously, Yarvin is this like very scary right wing intellectual boogeyman, but also like kind of, he's I
Kind of a droll guy.
yeah, I mean, he's kind of you can overstate his influence. I mean, you can say he's interacted with JD Vance and thus he's the puppet master. I think that's an exaggeration, but I think he does. He's around. So
Yeah.
he's around. He's hanging out. So I read this article he wrote about the Bolsheviks and Lenin, um,
Uh,
and basically the argument he made is I'm a Bolshevik, that I side with the Bolsheviks, and his argument was that the Mensheviks are they're kind of behind in history. Like they're trying to adapt the czar and make the czar more fair and adapt society, right? And he basically said the point is to completely reconfigure, completely reorganize society, and that the Bolsheviks were right about that. And so, I was wondering
yep.
what you think about because I feel like you would agree with that to a large degree, but I'm curious about what you think about his like his take there in the context of
Yeah,
what you
that's
know.
an insight. Steve Bannon also says, Lenin was right,
Yeah.
power's in the streets and, we need revolution. And, so, I mean, the paradox of our time is that change is coming from the right
Sure.
and that the left is really conservative now. It's trying to preserve something that is falling apart and having to be put back together through more or less radical means. That some of which will happen, it will just happen, and some of it will happen through political action, but a lot of it will not happen through political action. So I think that Curtis Yarvin, I think that his insight into Lenin and Bolshevism, it goes to his monarchism. I mean, what I would call his Bonapartism.
Mm-hmm.
But again, in a bourgeois revolutionary sense and in a kind of Napoleonic sense. So he wants an Oliver Cromwell, he wants a George Washington, he wants a Napoleon, right? And of course, that's very different from the Marxist concept of Bonapartism, because the Marxist concept of Bonapartism is the futility of that
Mm-hmm.
in capitalism. So it's kind of the exact opposite of
Right.
what they think it is. So I saw a debate between Curtis Yarvin and Danielle Allen, and she's a Black American
Mm-hmm.
political philosopher. She was at the University of Chicago when I was a graduate student there. She was a junior faculty. She was a kind of a wunderkind.
Mm-hmm.
She was like a kind of up and coming like major person, but instead she's become a kind of whatever you know, provost dean something or other at Harvard as some administrator, and she's lost the plot. But they had a debate, and what was interesting about the debate was that they both ended up kind of agreeing on liberalism. Like
Mm.
they both sort of came around to liberalism and were critiquing this society for not measuring up,
Mm.
right? So they both kind of started with Aristotle and Aristotle's politics, and it's like monarchy, oligarchy, democracy. And then Yarvin had a way of reinterpreting that as uh, populism was democracy, prestige was oligarchy,
Mm.
and I forget what he called monarchy, but he called it something else. And but basically they were like, well, all three are good potentially.
Mm.
All three are bad potentially. All three are tyrannical potentially, but all three are good potentially if you have it by law. If you have it like according to law. Like if you have a monarchy that works through law, if you have an oligarchy that works through law, if you have democracy that works through law. So basically liberal democracy, basically constitutional republicanism. And then it kind of doesn't matter whether it's democratic, oligarchical, or monarchical, especially because the US actually has a combination of those things. That's
Mm.
the whole point,
Right.
right? And so I was just like, okay, so this is a lot of Sturm und Drang just to arrive at your kind of commonsensical, like US Constitution, liberal democracy, right? But
Mm-hmm.
instead, it has to be all fireworks. It's got to be Curtis Yarvin, I'm a monarchist, because I want the president to be a CEO. And it's like, yeah, the president's already a CEO. Like, what are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, now but he sees like decisiveness, executive action, right? So he likes your Lockean John Locke, like your executive prerogative kind of stuff, and that's great, fine, right? So it seems like it's some kind of disenchantment with the depoliticized bureaucratic kind of
Yeah.
stasis of American politics,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's sort of exaggerated, right? But then, like I said, Danielle Allen, who's just your kind of like smart, self-conscious, like Aristotelian political philosopher, Democratic Party kind of person, you know, arrives, without too much contortion at the same place.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like, okay, so really the question is, why don't we have that? Why don't we have adequate liberal democracy today? Really? I would say capitalism,
Right. Yeah.
right? But then the question is, how are we defining that problem?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, most of the critiques of capitalism now are just liberal democratic critiques.
Right.
And so that's fine, and maybe even there's some room for reform there, but I think the long-term problem is not going to go away, and there are going to be perverse consequences to any attempts at reform. That's what
Mm-hmm.
we should be kind of aware of, right? That's what history teaches us,
Mm-hmm.
you know now so again, his kind of, it's kind of a one-sided, it's a tendentious kind of affinity for Bolshevism. But,
Right.
I know that all my anti-Leninist leftists are like, yeah, Chris Cutrone is more like Curtis Yarvin because he's a Leninist. Ah. And it's like, that's just not really Lenin. That's not really Bolshevism. That's more like Stalinism. And there's a lot of nostalgia for Stalinism now. There's a lot of like celebration of like, I don't know, Chinese Communist Party, like China has coherent policy, they're able to act, they do things. And it's like it might appear that way, but it's also an out of control society that they're barely keeping together and that it is going into its own kind of crisis. It's experienced a political crisis already. That's what Xi comes out of,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's having an economic crisis, right? It's catching up with
Right.
it. And so, like this kind of fantasy of like, if only we could be like the Chinese.
Right.
No, fuck, no. You know what I mean? Because it's just not. It's not what people imagine it might be. They're dealing with the same problems we're dealing with, actually. At some fundamental level,
Right. Yeah.
they
That
are.
I do find it very unconvincing when people say that China is like ahead of us and we're progressing and we're all going to be China, and I feel like that's just never felt like convincing to me. That just doesn't feel like really.
It's
Uh,
a desire.
Yeah.
It's also a fear,
Yeah.
right? So there are kind of conservative liberals who are like, "Oh my God, the Democrats are going to make us like China." There's like
Hmm.
an irrational fear as well as an irrational desire
Hmm.
involved with this kind of US-China face-off, that we're going through. And I just don't think that it is that. I think US and China are really deeply involved
Like
with each
China's really
other.
just not that interesting, honestly. If you if you really boil it down,
Right.
it's just another country. They're dealing with their own problems. They're a state. They're not like this like completely different monster. Like the ori like this is like they're not like this Oriental
Right.
mysterious like emperor. Like they're not. We're
Right.
past that. I think we're past that.
Totally.
Yeah, but
Totally.
um, I did want to ask about. I guess a little bit more still on this topic. I did want to ask about Gillian Rose's Hegel Contra Sociology. And I wanted to
Yep.
ask you about it because there's a lot about it that I feel like you'd be sympathetic to.
Yep.
But then there's also, she does have a critique of like Adorno and
Hmm.
Lukács,
Hmm.
um, who, and I know you're sympathetic to both
And
of
of
them.
Marxism in general. Yeah.
Yeah. Because what she says is that Hegel really provides like the speculative, it really gets past like where we are now, where we're stuck with now. Whereas Adorno, I think she would argue, kind of recedes into kind of a understanding the present time, the present problems in our consciousness, without being able to, figure out like why that is the case or the greater trajectory or context of that. So, would you agree with her criticism of Adorno, or what do you think about that book overall? And yeah.
Okay. So I understand Gillian Rose, who influenced me a great deal. Um, in terms of, I found her to be one of the better writers on Adorno. So
Mm,
she has a book called The Melancholy Science on Adorno, um, that she wrote before uh, Hegel Contra Sociology. So her book Melancholy Science, also her book Hegel Contra Sociology, really influenced me a great deal, um, because I found it to be kind of head and shoulders above a lot of the secondary literature
mm,
on Adorno and on the Frankfurt School and on, Lukács and this kind of Frankfurt School tradition of Marxism.
mm-hmm,
I see her as a product of the New Left moment, where the New Left did motivate a recovery of Hegel.
mm,
So Robert Pippin
right.
is also in this cohort. There are many kind of scholars of German idealism that come out of that moment,
Mm-hmm,
that see some kind of clarity provided by Hegel for what they were struggling with. However, so I mentioned like Hegel as a liberal,
mm-hmm,
right? Um, it does sort of stay at that level, meaning I think that whether it's Robert Pippin or Gillian Rose, there's a critique of the New Left and its impasse, and then there's a critique of postmodernism and how postmodernism seems to abandon politics.
mm-hmm,
So there's a fundamental way that there's an attempt to reestablish the political world,
mm,
and the Frankfurt School then seems to be uh, part of that stuck character that they were trying to break out of.
right.
It seems sort of implicated in some way. It seems to have succumbed in some way. And that she traces that back to Marxism itself,
Mm-hmm,
right? That Marxism is also part of the stuck character.
mm,
And what I would remind everyone of is that for the new left, there is this thing Marxism, namely it's an official ideology of like a third of the world's population. It's the East Bloc, it's the
mm-hmm,
Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union, China, it's Cuba, Vietnam, it's Yugoslavia. I mean, it's like Marxism's a real thing.
right.
And there are these mass parties in Western Europe. There are communist parties in France and Italy, which are not insignificant countries. And obviously Marxism is a major force in the developing world as well. There's a whole kind of third world revolutionary movement after World War II. So Marxism is like a fact. And yet, the New Left experienced it as part of the stuck character of the world. That Marxism was part of the problem, which undoubtedly it was. And then the question is, well, are we going to go with a kind of postmodernist rejection of Marxism, that seems unsatisfying, or it seems to not get you far enough,
Hmm.
and it seems to land you back in some of the same problems. The way that I like to think of postmodernism in a way that, again, Gillian Rose clued me into, and other people like Moishe Postone and my professor and Robert Pippin, my other professor, clued me into that postmodernism was like a Stalinist critique of Stalinism, actually.
Mm.
That it actually took a kind of like weird, vulgar Marxist materialism and aimed it at Marxism itself and tried to like cleanse Marxism of its remaining
Interesting.
idealism,
Yeah.
you know? And so it's a kind of a Stalinist critique of Stalinism, um, because it's a kind of materialist critique of Marxism.
Hmm.
And that, not surprisingly, it had to fall back onto a kind of Heideggerian ontology to do that.
Right.
And obviously, Gillian Rose is very clued into that problem, as is Robert Pippin, as was Moishe Postone. So, I tend to think they were onto something, right? And so the question is, what is the Marxism that's not that, right? What is the Marxism that was not Stalinism? And that's where the Frankfurt School is there. And again, for Gillian Rose or for Robert Pippin or for Moishe Postone, they're like, did the Frankfurt School, weren't they kind of onto something already? Right. But then they're kind of frustrated with, there's a kind of unsatisfactory character to the Frankfurt School ultimately,
Hmm.
which then drives them back to Marx. But then it's like, yeah, Marx himself is this kind of mixed bag. There seem to be parts of Marx that lead to this impasse, that lead to this Stalinism. And then there are other aspects of Marx that don't, that seem to be more open,
Hmm.
more fruitful, more productive. So what Gillian Rose and Robert Pippin did was they kind of followed Lukács and Karl Korsch, and they were like, actually, it's the Hegelian part of Marx that gets us past Stalinism. So it's kind of the opposite of the
Hmm.
postmodernists who were like, actually, insofar as Stalinism is a problem, it's because it's Hegelian. It's totalitarian. It still has this residual idealism. It's a just so story.
Hmm.
It's an affirmation of history,
Hmm.
right? So she's trying to find an alternative to that. And I think that it's very fruitful, and that she traces it because postmodernism itself has a mixed heritage. It's not just Heidegger; it's also like structuralism, it's structural anthropology, structural linguistics, and that can be traced back to sociology.
Hmm.
And that's where she really goes,
Yeah.
right? Like sociology per se
Right.
might itself be a symptom of an abdication,
Hmm.
right? And she follows Adorno with that. I didn't, I wrote about Gillian Rose, but I didn't get into the critique of sociology. Sociology is a reification, sure. It's a kind of it's a science born in the capitalist era and bearing the marks of that. It takes up society as an object of knowledge, but in a reified way.
Mm.
And so it sort of itself comes into an impasse, and that's why we don't even do sociology anymore, right? We just do statistics, like we just do econometrics, like
Yeah.
political science and sociology are just gone because the
Hmm.
theory is gone. Like it's all been quantified out of existence as disciplines.
Right.
Right. And again, that's where someone like Benjamin Studebaker comes in and tries to restore a kind of substance to
Hmm.
political theory. Right. But then he has to go to Plato to get that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like Plato, Hobbes, and Marx. It's unclear exactly how much comes from Marx.
Right.
So she knows that there's something there, and that's good. Now, I think that with Lukács and Adorno, I think that what happens is she thinks that they succumb to their objects.
Mm.
And there are different ways of posing this, so not to be remiss to my elders and my contemporaries, but really my elders, I have a number of teachers in Marxism. Maybe the Frankfurt School, are they Weberian Marxists?
Mm.
Right? Is a kind of Weberianism that's running through that comes from Lukács, and that's kind of an undigested Weberianism, and that's the pessimism And that's the kind of default political liberalism, but in this kind of resigned way that
Mm,
ultimately caves into authoritarianism, right? Is it romantic in some way?
mm,
Is it some kind of like deep struggle with theology,
mm,
you know? Um, and so that's one way that she goes, but she also knows that Durkheim was a huge influence on Adorno.
right.
So there's another tradition of sociology besides the German tradition, and that's the French tradition. But she's also on guard because that leads to structural anthropology and, postmodernism by way of that. So, and then she's saying, okay, well, what's the issue? The issue is like positivism. Okay, Adorno has like a critique of positivism, but does it really reach to the speculative, right? And the Hegelian absolute.
Mm-hmm.
I should also say that I was also educated by Gillian Rose, her other books, which are on postmodernism, like The Dialectic of Nihilism, The Broken Middle. And she has a great book. One of her later works was Morning Becomes the Law. That's very much more sort of, it's like short essays. It's kind of straightforward about, like, again, politics. Like, she's like desperate in the
Mm,
80s and 90s to like restore basic politics, liberal democratic politics. So, what does speculation have to do with that?
mm-hmm.
Um, Again, it's this kind of social science contra politics. It's like technocracy, like social science
Mm,
is preventing us from really like taking the risk of politics. So there's something about speculative reason and the risk that one has to take in the political realm. I mean, it's at a certain level, it's very basic,
mm,
and yet it still resonates today,
mm-hmm.
right? Um, that we retreat into this technocratic realm, evidence-based. Do we have evidence-based? Have you heard this language? Evidence-based approaches
Yeah, of
to like
course. Yeah.
policy,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And she's just pulling her hair out, you know, because it's like, what the hell do you think evidence is proving or disproving? Like, how do you base policy on evidence when
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to change society, right? Like, what is this like reified, positivistic,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And again, this is what the 60s really revolted against. And they revolted against it in ways that are kind of unfortunate in certain respects, but we have to remember that that's worth revolting against. Because I think that the time that we're living in now, it's like there's a desire to restore the mid 20th century technocracy that actually never went away. It just became more brain dead. It became less ambitious. So the mid 20th century technocracy, the Fordist state, was very ambitious in its scope. It was like, okay, we killed fascism. Now we have to kill this other totalitarianism. But in the meantime, we're just going to make the world like scientific. We're going to do this, you know. Uh, Obviously, they've given up on that. Not entirely, but they have moderated the ambition almost out of existence. So there's also some of that with Gillian Rose, where it's like, where's the ambition to solve political problems? And maybe to even attempt to do so, we have to do this thing, speculative reason. And so it's some kind of weird reaching back to bourgeois thought,
Mm-hmm.
bourgeois philosophy, right? Bourgeois reason. And that's great. It's completely understandable in the postmodernist era. I just think that, Marxism puts an asterisk there. There's a little bit of a problem there. Like, in other words, it wasn't like an accident or a wrong turn that we went to bureaucracy and technocracy. Also, that's not just some kind of weird demonic force of its own, the kind of iron law of oligarchy or iron law of bureaucracy or rationalization, Weber. It's not that's not a good way of thinking about it. It's much more specific to capitalism, and it shows up in different ways in different phases of history. It's different in the early 20th century than in the
Mm-hmm.
late 20th century. But that's how I understand her, with the benefit of hindsight. Look, this is not, again, I tend to be deflationary in the way that I approach things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, let's get it down to brass tacks. What is this really about? You know, without it being like a canard, without it just being like some materialist interpretation or something. But like, let's get at the actual problem,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore why the solution appears thusly. Why speculative reason? Really just bourgeois reason. You know, why that seemed like the answer. And it is a kind of an answer, of course it is. But also, it's just not available in the same way. And do you really have to go all the way down the Hegelian highway
Mm-hmm.
to to
Right.
get back to bourgeois reason? Because she's got like Kant, neo-Kantianism.
Mm-hmm.
She's got this kind of Kant whipping boy or something
Mm-hmm.
that I think is unfortunate. I think Kant is speculative philosophy. He is. Clearly. Rousseau is speculative philosophy. I feel like the mid 20th century people, the new leftists, they just couldn't handle certain things. There were certain things that were just like radioactive. Like Rousseau was radioactive. And Kant was somehow, I don't know, turned into a cardboard cutout of himself. It's yeah. So that's how I kind of myself make sense
Right.
of these kinds of things. Um, but like I said, I learned a lot from Gillian Rose. She clued me into a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
She is a good representative of what her generation struggled with,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and that those problems haven't gone away, but they don't appear quite the same way to us today.
Right. I guess as we get closer to the end here, I wanted to ask you about my conversation with Daniel Tutt, in which we, mentioned you a bit, and we also just sort of had a conversation about, socialism itself or Marxism itself. So yeah, I was curious if you had any like responses or main things you wanted to reply to with that.
You'd have to refresh me. What were
Right.
your takeaways from that
So
conversation?
what I on the Bonapartism part, when I was talking about you, I tried to maintain that I'm not sure about your analysis of Trump himself, and but I do think that Daniel, the way he was kind of talking about your Bonapartism, is as if your analysis is like purely affirmative, like you're saying that Bonapartism exists, it's how it is always going to be, and we should just ally ourselves with some sufficiently powerful candidate. And I
Yeah,
just
really
didn't
unfortunate.
I just
Yeah, that's not my
my
perspective.
personal
Yeah.
counter argument, my personal counter
Uh-huh.
argument was that you actually yourself make an argument regarding Lassalle that's kind of like what maybe like Miliband or Lassalle, like these more statist thinkers. That's what they want to do is they want to wield the Bonapartist state in a positive manner. And what you say in that essay is that that's not. You really have to transcend that. You have to transcend the state, but also the anti-state dichotomy. You have to transcend
Yes.
that and really deal with society itself and all
Right.
the problems. So that's the argument I tried to make against him to say that, regardless of Trump, I think that's your theory, and I think that's
It
a different
is.
thing. Yeah.
It is. That's right. Very much. And so, of course, I had had a conversation with him. I had heard your conversation with him. And I did feel like, okay, I already had this idea that I had to write an essay. Bonapartism is not Bonaparte. I had the title, I had the basic outlines of the argument
Mm-hmm.
in the back of my mind for many months. And, I did a lot of writing this year so far, and I finally got around to it. I was like, okay, I got to do this now. And it could very well be that that your conversation with Daniel definitely lit the fire under me and like, okay, I gotta finally do this. And really deal with it as a kind of more Marxological discussion, but then also the elephant in the room, Trump. Or
Mm-hmm.
I guess the metaphor is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, I think is really more
Yeah.
accurate than the elephant in the room. And so I mean, I've been at this for 10 years with Trump, trying to get the left to have a sober approach to Trump,
Mm-hmm.
meaning Trump does represent a change, but it's also ordinary capitalist politics. And so I think that the question there is neoliberalism. meaning it could be that younger people, like millennials and Zoomers, they only know neoliberalism. Whereas I actually lived through the kind of consolidation of neoliberalism. I saw it coming into existence, and I had people and things that were still remnants of the Fordist reality that
Mm-hmm.
neoliberalism was transforming. So I could see it in a way that it wasn't just equivalent to capitalism. It wasn't equivalent to bourgeois society. It wasn't equivalent to liberalism because this is what people say capitalism, they mean neoliberalism. They say liberalism, they mean neoliberalism. They say bourgeois society or civil society, they mean neoliberal versions of that. I think Ben Studebaker has this idea that the problem with Marxists is that they think that they're living in late capitalism, but really we're living in middle capitalism, and that the older Marxist tradition was based on early capitalism.
Mm.
And my response to that is what he's calling middle capitalism is neoliberalism, and he's not prepared for what's coming next. And I don't think that what's coming next will be late capitalism.
Mm.
Like so I don't think of it just that way. So I think that the issue here is the millennial left wanted to overcome neoliberalism. Trump represents the overcoming of neoliberalism, and they reject his overcoming of neoliberalism. And they think it's fascism, but maybe it's not fascism, maybe it's Bonapartism. And that's also bad,
Mm-hmm.
right? And right, so I kind of feel like, well, in fact, the capitalist state is inherently Bonapartist,
Mm.
and it's not the problem of the strongman leader. In other words, the disaggregation of the liberal from the Marxist conception of Bonapartism. I think that Daniel interviewed an Italian woman who is a scholar on concepts of
Mm.
Caesarism and Bonapartism in Gramsci.
Mm-hmm.
And what she said was that the 18th Brumaire, that writing in particular by Marx, she called heterodox,
Mm.
meaning Marx has one idea, and then he sort of took a break from that idea to write
Mm.
the 18th Brumaire. He kind of wrote against himself in the 18th Brumaire.
Mm.
And I thought, well, that's an interesting way of dealing with it because I actually think that the 18th Brumaire is like orthodox Marxism.
Mm.
It's Marx's actual political theory. It's not him doing this thought experiment of thinking against himself.
Mm.
Right? And what she meant by that was orthodox Marxism is a kind of economic determination of politics.
Mm.
And that the 18th Brumaire allows for considering a political determination of
Mm.
economics,
Right.
right? And so I think that that was a kind of an indicative or telling kind of misapprehension of Marx. And so then it bears, understanding. Uh, I'm also influenced. I'm a scholar of Walter Benjamin
Mm.
and his Arcades project. And Benjamin is like a foundational figure for Adorno.
Mm-hmm.
And the Arcades project is about Bonapartism, the Second Empire, as the product of failed revolution.
Mm.
And he was doing that in the 20s and 30s because he was thinking that the world he was living in was like the world of the Second Empire. It was the aftermath of the failed revolution, but not 1848, now 1917,
Mm-hmm.
right? And again, I think that Daniel would have a problem there because he thinks that we throw the baby out with the bathwater if we say that Soviet Union and Communist China are products of failed revolution.
Mm.
So that the idea that they were Bonapartist states, that they were politics conditioned by capitalism, in the sense of self-alienated politics, right? The realm of political alienation, bureaucracy, bureaucratic states. Even the totalitarianism idea. I think that there are a lot of very poorly understood and undigested concepts. Like, for instance, totalitarianism. A totalitarian state is actually a kind of a lawless state, right? It's a kind of like it's really characterized by corruption.
Mm.
It's not totalitarian in the sense of monolithic.
Mm.
Quite the contrary. And in fact, its monolithism is also its incoherence. So it's what we were talking about before about China.
Mm-hmm.
And that again, that's the Bonapartism. right? And not corruption in the sense of like money or, corruption in the sense of a kind of means ends reversal.
Mm.
Again, maybe a Weberian idea, that the state becomes an end in itself, which then raises the question of, but wait, it's not supposed to be an end in
Mm.
itself. It's supposed to be a means for society.
Right.
And what does it mean for society to be subjected to the state? Isn't that the society failing to pursue its own ends, actually? In other words, that bureaucracy is not the cause, but it's
Mm-hmm.
the effect, it's the symptom. And, that's Bonapartism. And again, it's not like fully developed in Marx. It isn't,
Mm.
and I think that that's also frustrating for people. Um, you know, I, my own education in these things is such that I can kind of elaborate on Marx. Um, and follow other Marxists, whether Frankfurt School or others, but also follow other kinds of political philosophy and sort of see, oh, actually, Marx was onto that already, um, and that is what we're dealing with now, and that what's really instructive about Trump, about the Trump era, is that Trump is this like. He's like this Curtis Yarvin, like CEO kind of model of executive. He's coming in to like crack heads and do things, and then it turns out, actually, he can't a- achieve quite what he sets out to achieve. He can and he can't,
Mm-hmm.
and that it's really an issue because I think that my own students, for example, my academic students, I would say things, I'd make quips about Trump,
Mm-hmm.
and it would sort of disturb them, and then they'd be like, "Oh, Chris, you must like Trump because Trump shows that you can change things." And I was like, "Well, it shows that we can try." But whether it's going to show that we can is something else. And so I do think that, we're on this ride. We have to deal with the Trumpian reality. And the least that we can do is try to learn from it.
Mm.
And in order to learn from it, we have to see it clearly for what it is. And then to try to apply Marxism to it is like, it raises all these questions. And I do think that all the ways that people have of understanding these things, like populism, even the kind of liberal notion of Bonapartism, I mean, let alone like fascism, tend to obscure the phenomenon, actually. They tend to use a Marxist phrase, conceal more than they reveal
Mm.
about the phenomenon. That Trump is both more and less significant than people think. He's less significant because it's Trump. He's like this kind of buffoonish amateur kind of guy, right, in the realm of politics. He's more because there really is a transition to post neoliberalism that we're living through. And so neoliberalism is not a forever thing.
Mm.
And I do think that that's hard for younger people to appreciate. And, like I always say, I feel like the only purpose of my existence is being this age, meaning I'm old enough to know that it wasn't always like this and therefore it won't always be like this. It will still be capitalism, but it won't be like the capitalism that we've experienced in the 21st century. It's going to be different, and good, bad, and different. Like it's not. I'm not saying that this is a good thing. And the way it's going to happen politically, like this kind of agony that we've been going through the last 10 years, has a significance. It isn't like a mistake. It sort of reveals something about the nature of political power and these political parties, democracy. It opens up all these questions. So Curtis Yarvin is a symptom.
Right.
Like these people, Bronze Age pervert. These are symptoms. It's not a symptom of like civilizational collapse.
Mm.
It's a symptom of a crisis of liberal democracy, which turns out happens every generation or so. There was one in the 60s and there's one in the last 20 years, basically, that we're kind of coming to some resolution of now.
Right.
And it's going to be resolved by conservatives. So I'll just say something about like the EU deal that Trump just did.
Mm.
It's, Ursula von der Linden, she's a Christian Democrat from Germany. And, Merz, who's the Chancellor of Germany, these are conservative politicians. Um, the French might complain or whatever. Keir Starmer is a Labour politician, but he's a conservative Labour politician.
Yeah.
Like, this is all being affected by conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
This is just happening. The Japanese government, like, basically, conservative governments are coming together to guarantee the future of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
They're making these commitments. They're bailing out the United States. They are. The US is forcing them to bail the US out because they have no choice because they depend on the US too much in all sorts of ways. And so they're doing this kind of multi aspect paving the way for the next stage of capitalism. And is it going to work out just as they think? No, of course not. Right? But and so this whole idea that like it's fascism or that it's populism or whatever, like no. Do you know what I mean? Like this is just we can actually see what's going on, especially after 10 years and especially in the second Trump term. And we can see it as like there's a certain pathos to politics and capitalism. There is. And I think that the phrase that I use is, where Hegel could see a rogue playing a hero's part, that Marx sees that even a hero plays a rogue's part in capitalism. Meaning that, I mean, it's like the Obama thing now, It's like Obama, who's like the spick and span, clean politician, perfect ego ideal guy, except he smokes, right? But, it turns out he's a compromised politician, who either wielded the deep state or was manipulated by the deep state into doing unethical things that the deep state does,
Sure.
and that politicians do, and it's like, well, who's responsible? Is it these corrupt politicians or is it these state actors who act out of bureaucratic self-interest? And why did they react to Trump so strongly that they did these things that were completely unnecessary and futile and caused a lot of problems? I mean, the Republicans have a point when they say the whole Ukraine war might be the fault of this Russiagate hoax. Hundreds of thousands of people might have died because of the Russiagate hoax, meaning Vladimir Putin might have done what he did because he looked at what the US state was doing vis-a-vis Trump. And he might have just thought the only way he can deal with it is to act militarily. Right. And of course, he just meant to knock out the Ukrainian government very quickly. And instead, it's turned into a trench warfare slog. That's not what was intended. But he may not have taken that step if he didn't think that the Democratic Party and the US security state was so hostile to him, which is, what they seemed to show in the way they went after Trump. So these things do have consequences. But maybe hundreds of thousands of people can die, and it's actually not very consequential in terms of world history,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because ultimately Russia is this thing, but it matters a great deal more what the US, the EU, and China do in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's again, how do we cut through the sensationalism, the 24-hour news cycle, and the endless propaganda? And what's great about Trump is that he's this awkward figure. It's not buttoned up. It's not opaque the way Obama was opaque, the way Biden was opaque. It's just hanging out there. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, I don't know, we should take that opportunity. And again, my contribution is, as a Marxist, I don't know if it amounts to much, but there are some things that I have to say as a Marxist that might help us get some handle on it. Like, why is politics proving so elusive? Why is it conspiracy theory? Why is it so opaque? Why is there this funny means ends rationality at work? You know, um, what, you know, is this a brand new situation or have we been here for a while?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think that, again, I have to try to do the Socratic thing as a public intellectual, and I've tried to get people to think. And I think that people react to the provocation and never get to the substance. And I'm having to rethink, my strategies. I'm trying different things. We'll see. But clearly it's like introducing this word Bonapartism into the mix has probably caused more harm than good,
Maybe.
right? Because then people have just landed on a liberal concept of Bonapartism, which is kind of like it's the easy one. I was trying to invoke the hard concept from Marx, but they don't really want to take that up.
Right. I mean, I will say for me personally that reading the 18th Brumaire, I think I had a much grander conception. I didn't read the 18th Brumaire and I was like, wow, Trump is a bad guy. Like I already felt that way. Like that didn't.
Right,
That's
right,
not an insight.
right,
Really, the insight
right.
I got from that was, oh, we've been here before. Why is that? What are the underlying causes of that? That's really the kind
Yep,
of insight that I got from that. But obviously, I can't speak for other people. They might not be. They might be saying
that's
Trump is
great.
bad. Um, I did actually want to very briefly talk about something for my own interest that just came
Yep.
up because I thought it was kind of funny and I thought you might find it funny. Maybe we'll see. So there was you. I think I've heard you mention you've heard of Destiny, the political
Oh,
streamer
absolutely.
guy.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there was like a big debate. There's a whole bunch of like personal drama. I think like caught like wrapped up in this, but basically there was a big debate yesterday with a bunch of people, and I was watching it because I might be talking to someone who was part of that debate in a couple of days. And
Uh-huh.
so I definitely want to make sure to watch that. And really, what the debate was about is like a 2v2. And so Destiny and his partner Connor, they were basically saying that socialism is an actual thing. It actually has a purpose behind it, and it's not liberal in the sense that they want to overturn the liberal order, right?
Right.
And then the other side was basically saying, no, socialism is the Labor Party. It's reform,
Uh-huh.
it's welfare, and one of the people on the other side calls himself a socialist now. He didn't before; he was just a liberal, and he is very
Uh-huh.
much like a policy guy. Like he's the guy who looks at the
Uh-huh.
numbers and says we need this policy. And so his whole
Uh-huh.
argument is that there's a tradition of socialism that's just welfare state, and that's cool, and we can be socialist to our welfare state. And I thought this was interesting because like it really shows like this kind of incapacity to grasp like anything in a way. Like Destiny, I think Destiny and Connor are closer to the truth, even though the way they're conceiving of it is from the idea that they just want to defend liberalism, right?
Right.
Which is
Right.
closer to my opinion too. But what they're
Right.
identifying is that socialism is more than just this watered down like capitalist thing. And so in a way they're actually closer to the truth, and I feel like a
Yep.
socialist would
Yep.
have to take their side on that
Yep.
debate because otherwise you just water it down and it just becomes progressive capitalist politics. And I don't know, I just thought that whole debate was kind of frustrating and interesting because they kept talking about like they invoked all the famous like leftist, like they invoked like China and like and I was just frustrated because like none of these people understand that they're having debates that are like 20th century socialist debates basically.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Retreading this.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's tricky because so there are people that I know, one of whom you interviewed was Matt McManus,
Mhm.
right? Who, I think that one of the ways that they have this fraught relationship to me
Mhm.
is that they want to say that socialism is imminent to liberalism.
Mhm.
And liberalism, not just in terms of like a progressive capitalist reform welfare state kind of thing, but liberalism in the sense of political liberty,
Mhm.
civil liberty, social freedom. Um, and, but then they don't want to go all the way down the Marxist highway, right? So they want to kind of tailor Marxism to fit what they think is possible, which
Mhm.
is like kind of welfare state reformism. And so I think that, I kind of prevent that from kind of, just happening,
Right.
like I'm there to sort of remind them, oh, So now, as far as the destiny perspective, the kind of anti-socialist liberal perspective. Um, Again, neoliberalism. One could say liberalism too, but really it's neoliberalism. It's kind of ordo-liberalism, we might say. Like again, I mentioned Karl Popper, that it looks like the only alternative to liberalism is fascism.
Mhm.
And you can call that socialism, but basically it's fascism. So it's it's red fascism or it's some other kind of fascism, but it's all basically fascism.
Hmm.
And it's Plato's Republic is basically a fascist state or whatever, like, and Rousseau's basically a fascist. And if the Jacobins had had their way, it would have been fascism. Whatever, right? Fine, cool. All right, so it's kind of like, well, there might be a different way of thinking about this. And again, I feel like an earlier 20th century, like anti-Marxism, a kind of post-Marxism, a kind of quasi-socialism, just had a more supple way of dealing with this. So it's where, it's basically, can people acknowledge that the realities of modern capitalism make liberalism impossible,
Hmm.
right? There's this crazy guy on Fox, Mark Levin.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And but he's a conservative liberal,
Right.
right? And like a lot of the Republicans are. And and I feel like that's basically, that's the authentic position, you know. Whereas I feel like the Democratic Party version really kind of fudges the issue.
Mm.
Meaning, like, if you're going to say socialism wants to overturn the liberal order, you have to admit in some way that the welfare state overturns the welfare order. I mean, the liberal order, right? That the welfare state is already a kind of infringement of liberalism. You have to sort of acknowledge that. And I just think that they're not prepared to deal with that. So I feel like the kind of ordo liberals or your kind of conservative liberals, that they're kind of grudging about the welfare state. They're like, yeah, you need to do this, but you don't want to give in too much to it because it will take us down the road to serfdom,
Hmm.
the totalitarian highway. But I feel like it's kind of really skewed now, where it seems like the only alternative to neoliberalism is fascism. And it's like, or like post-liberalism. There's this other discourse that's happening now, like post-liberalism,
Mm.
like the left and the right, the Trump era, the populists,
Right.
it could be like post-liberalism. Is it like left-wing post-liberalism or is it right-wing post-liberalism? And it's like, we've been in post-liberalism for a while. We've been in post-liberalism for a while, and neoliberalism didn't reverse that. It was itself a form of post-liberalism. That's why it's neoliberalism. So I think that that's, you know, being aware of that, that capitalism already demands a kind of authoritarian state. And I mean, there's a lot of rank ideology, I would say, meaning there's a lot of like convenient blinders or blinkers that people have, and I just, as a leftist, as someone like with a lot of background on the left, I feel like, the mass incarceration in the United States, isn't that already kind of fascism? Like meaning like, we're kind of, like staving off this fear,
Hmm.
right? Um, of authoritarianism, of socialism, of fascism. But isn't it already here? Like, isn't it already like woven into the fabric of things? And so we just sort of like conveniently forget things that don't
Hmm.
fit our worldview. Now, unfortunately, the left poses these things in histrionic terms,
Mm.
and that doesn't help,
Right.
you know? So I don't know, when I think of like, I don't know, Bukele, the president of El Salvador, and the CENTCOT, like the terrorism center, like prison or whatever,
Hmm.
like where they put the migrants, and why does that prison exist? It exists because he was struggling to wrest control of the country from these, organized crime,
Mm-hmm.
gang, you know, drug cartels, whatever, MS-13, and that MS-13 has its roots in the civil war in El Salvador going all the way back. And then he is himself a member of the FMLN. He was part of the FMLN. Those are the leftists, right? But then he had to, turn against because the FMLN got kind of compromised by these drug cartels, right? So it's a very complicated story.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a clean left wing, right wing idea, or it's not a clean like liberal, illiberal. It just isn't. It doesn't really, and I kind of feel like the problem with Destiny is that he can be a little bit smarmy. He can be like, oh, that's El Salvador or something,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, no, El Salvador is here. I mean, and that's why the migrants from the US are there, right? Because El Salvador is here. Like
Mm-hmm.
MS-13 is here. That's why they're being sent back to, like why migrants are being sent to that prison there because this is one reality that we're dealing with here. And so I think that there's a lot of these debates are hampered by just that kind of blindness. It's like liberalism is something that we have here, but of course we don't expect there to be liberalism in the Middle East or in El
Mm-hmm.
Salvador. And it's like, these worlds are not, you know, um, so separated, and but they're also not. You can't also just sort of collapse them. You can't just say, "Oh, settler colonialism in the U.S., settler colonialism in Gaza." It's just like one thing, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, again, the histrionics on the left really, really deprive them of their insights, of their potential insights. But I am enough of a leftist that I'm not going to forget any of those insights, even if I'm very critical of the histrionics.
Right.
But I do think that, like, I don't know, Zoran Mandani,
Mm-hmm.
like, is he a left populist? Is he like the cure to the Democratic Party problem? Is he the cure to, like, is he the, appropriate response to Trump? Laura Ingraham, right, who's a Fox News host, right? She said in the first Trump term, when AOC was elected in 2018, she said the left populists and the right populists should get together
Mm-hmm.
against the neoliberal establishment. Steve Bannon
Right.
this year said, the radical left is not the problem
Mm-hmm.
because they'd be targeted by the deep state as much as we are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He's like, we should actually get together against the deep state. They would have an interest in doing so. It's foolish that they don't. Right? And so I feel like that's the world that we're in. And then like Destiny is now going to be like, I don't know, some like defender of the center or something. Like I do think that there's that impulse now too of like, okay, we're under assault from the left and the right, and we just have
Right.
to reestablish. And again, it leaves aside, well, why did Obamaism fail? Because I think that's the thing. The thing is, there was a lot of hope in Obama, and I think there's a lot of bitterness, but also confusion about why it failed, why and how it failed,
Mm-hmm.
and how we sort through all this stuff to come to more of a kind of sober but coherent perspective on reality, I think is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And it again, it's not helped by the fact that a lot of things associated with Trump and Trumpism are just a priori tabooed. You're not even allowed to contemplate like the Russiagate hoax, because that's like a right wing thing. And it's like, it's actually a window onto reality. It tells you why Obama failed. It does tell you this, it does tell you some story, again, minus the histrionics, minus the conspiracy theory. It tells you something about the nature of political power, the impasse of the state, bureaucratism, technocracy, and its failure. Like COVID does too. But again, it's like people don't want to fall into like, I don't know, right wing talking points. And it's like, yeah, but some things were demonstrated, and it's a shame that only the right picks up on it,
Sure.
you know? So I think that's really the problem. It's like people know that neoliberalism is at an end, but then they don't like the response, which is the right, and they're not really prepared to deal with why there isn't the possibility of what they would consider a left response, like, a Bernie, the
Hmm.
Squad, Zoran Mandani. This is just not going to work. And, Trumpism is not going to work either, but it is what's happening. And so we should at least pay attention to it
Hmm.
and not just, willfully blind ourselves to it. Um, you know, Political education opportunities, occasions for it are hard to come by. And it should be possible to approach these things in a non-paranoid way. I don't know,
Right.
but that's what I would hope, and the podcasting, like the fever stream kind of like, thing, um you know the clickbaiting, the hate watching, like, it doesn't lend itself to what's called for now.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like personal drama, litigating, and very cyclical. I actually, when I talked to the guy who was there, I think really the point I want to make is like, what are we? What I'm thinking of that Kant quote about history and about it repeating
Hmm.
itself, and I'm just thinking like, what are we doing here? Like, what are we? Like, we're just kind of like yelling at each other over socialism, and it's like, you both have a like, there's a reason behind what you're saying, but you're not talking about the reason. You're talking about just the thing endlessly. And so, yeah, I mean, I really do feel like there needs to be, like, kind of my idea right now is there needs to honestly be a reinvigoration of like liberals and like the left, and like an actual substantive debate can take place. But these things need to be reconstituted, because right now it really does feel like everything is like impoverished. No one is really saying anything on any side. It's all just, yeah, it's very empty. So
Very
that,
threadbare.
yeah, so that's kind of,
It's very, yeah,
yeah,
that's right.
yeah.
I mean, I think that, Ben Studebaker, it's interesting. He thinks that he's got a kind of ecumenical approach as far as like politics is concerned, which is that,
Hmm.
he would like to see a higher level of public discourse among conservatives, liberals, and the left and socialists. And, my response to that is probably the only way that we would be able to get a better level of thinking and discourse, public debate on, among liberals and conservatives is if socialism leads the way on that. In other words, they will only be motivated to get more serious by, you know, a better version of the specter of socialism, right? Because right now
Hmm.
there's this specter of socialism, but, really there has to be a higher level of socialist discourse in order for the liberals and the conservatives to feel the need to really respond.
Right.
Otherwise it's just circling the drain.
Hmm.
There is a kind of race to the bottom at the level of public debate and thinking about these things. Like I said, the Danielle Allen Curtis Yarvin thing, it was almost self-consciously to one side. It was like, we're going to have this debate, we're going to have this discussion, knowing that it doesn't matter. Like there was a kind of resigned character to the whole thing, like especially
Yeah.
by Danielle Allen,
Right.
you know, because she was going to be like, the next great political thinker of like progressive liberalism, and no, that just didn't happen. And even though Curtis Yarvin is given this kind of, nefarious influence kind of attribution, actually he's the kind of lost intellectual,
Hmm.
and so, uh, you know, but it's kind of like, yeah, I don't think that there's going to be much motivation among Democratic Party people to raise the level. Again, what we have instead is this funny kind of left populism demagogy like Zoran Mamdani, that's just this kind of placeholder for something.
Mm.
It's not, it really is just like a wish list and talking points.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not terribly serious. And
Mm.
it's not a way of like reshaping the electorate, establishing
Right.
new constituencies, establishing new kind of political responsibility between the government and the public. Like it's just not even trying
I mean, from what
to
I
do.
understand, like his biggest like support base is just educated, like privileged.
Whites.
Yeah, it's like the people who already support that kind of thing support that thing, but that's not changing. That's not
The
changing
substance of
anything.
it.
Right.
It's not really. And
Yeah.
then you're left with this kind of like, but what does Eric Adams represent? Like there is this kind of untapped, like, again, the attempt to represent like society, the working class, something, but
Hmm.
there isn't even an
Right.
attempt at that really. And so that's the other thing is that, uh, increasingly, I think the left is going to give up on their notion of like the Democrats needing a working class base or anything like that. You know, like these questions that were raised by the millennial left are fast disappearing just in the urgency of like stopping Trumpism or
Hmm.
something, you know, and stopping like Democratic Party accommodation to Trumpism or something, because that's what the Mamdani people will accuse Cuomo and Adams of being, as being somehow concessions to Trumpism,
Right.
And so that just sweeps under the rug like the whole question of like city politics and constituencies and can you represent the public and
Hmm.
like it just, yeah, casts all of that into oblivion.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we've talked about a lot of important stuff here. I really appreciate talking about Hegel and history, and yeah, just the really what's going on here. And yeah, I really appreciate you coming on again. I had a good time talking about these things. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching.